Good morning, everyone. This is Anupama Bharti, Assistant Professor in the Landscape Department and School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal. So, it is a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Landscape Department in the session of Landscape and City Design, which has been conducting the Unconfined Landscape Guest Lecture Series for the Master's third semester. In continuation to that, today's session is going to be very informative and inspiring, as today we have with us a renowned speaker who does not need any kind of introduction, as he is a very famous and well known in landscape, urban design, and architectural fraternity all over the world. It is an immense pleasure and honor for me to introduce Professor Rahul Mehrotra. He is the Professor of Urban Design and Planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He is a practicing architect, urban designer, and educator. His Mumbai and Boston based firm, RMA Architects, has been designing and executing projects over 30 years,
in
including
landscape,
government and
urban
private
design, and
institutions, corporate workplaces, private homes, and unsolicited projects driven by the firm's commitment to advocacy in the city of Mumbai. The firm has designed a software campus for Hewlett Packard in Bangalore, led the restoration of Chahal Mahalla Palace in Hyderabad, and formulated a conservation master plan for the Taj Mahal with the Taj Mahal Conservation Collaborative. The firm has recently designed and built a social housing project for 100 elephants and their caretakers in Jaipur. In 2015, RMA Architects completed the Lab of the Future on Novartis campus in Basel, Switzerland, and were the finalists in an international design competition for the Museum of Modern Art in Sydney. Recent projects of the firm include a library for the School of Architecture at SEP, the Faculty of Art and Sciences at Ahmedabad University, and a School of Public Policy, IIM Ahmedabad. Professor Rahul Mehrotra has written and researched related to architecture, conservation, and urban planning and design in Mumbai. His writings include authoring and co-authoring Bombay, the Cities Within, which covers the city's urban history from the 1600 to the present, Banganga Sacred Tanks, Public Places Bombay, and many more, including recent book titled Taj Mahal Multiple Narratives. And his current research is on the small towns and emerging urban conglomeration in India, is expected to be published soon. He has extensively lectured upon urban open spaces, limits of urban design, urban age developing urban futures, emphasizing on adaptive solutions to the current urban issues in the city of Mumbai. There is a lot more to say about him, but due to the limitation of time, I am restricting myself to continue further. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rahul Mehrotra. Here, the director of SPA Bhopal, Professor Sridharan, is here also with us. So now the audience is yours, sir. So welcome, Professor Mehrotra.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your very kind words. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your invitation. It's always, unfortunately, I've not done anything at SPA Bhopal. So as soon as you wrote to me, I thought this was an occasion to make up for that loss. And please extend my gratitude to Mr. Sridharan, or Professor Sridharan. And and thank you again.
thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks. And so I think you asked me, when you asked me to talk, and you said the Kumbh Mela. Now, I mean, I've spoken so much about the Kumbh Mela, I've written about the Kumbh Mela. So I thought, yes, I'll share with you the Kumbh Mela, but very quickly, and maybe some things, but basically maybe contextualize this more broadly, because I think as professionals and academics and pedagogues in India, we must actually bring attention to some very urgent issues. And I call this sort of the unsettling of urban design in some ways, because that's why I've titled this Urban Design in a Time of Flux, because I do believe we're in a time of flux. And unless we recognize this, I think I think we'll be marginalized in terms of our agency, but also in terms of the next generation and what they engage with. I think it's very critical that we see the problem correctly. And so this is really my attempt to expand how we see urban design to include many other phenomena. And so I think in today's world, flux, I think, becomes very important. And this notion of a fluctuation, of change, of instability, it can extend in negative ways into unrest, into mutability, just in the way the coronavirus is mutating now. And so this sort of idea that the world is in a steady state, or that we aspire to make cities that make the world in a steady state, will be looking, I think, at in the wrong place for the problem. And so therefore, I think what we have to find as designers, as planners, as architects, as landscape designers, is how do we, what is the agency we have in understanding flux, and how can we respond to flux? Because flux, perhaps the only constant in all our lives is change. And so therefore, we keep resisting it. And therefore, how do we actually talk about it? And so I'm going to kind of frame the Kumbh Mela, but within a broader rubric of this idea of flux, because I think it's much more important to see it conceptually in broader terms. Otherwise, it just becomes an exotic phenomenon. So this was a map that was made by some architects, Dutch architects, for the Rotterdam Biennale. And it is really a wonderful map which shows how, in what we call the global north and south, and I don't want to use the word global north and south, but just this is the north and south divide, how 73% of the world's income resides with about 14% of the world's population, and how 27% of the world's income resides with 86% of the world's population. This is phenomenal. And what you see in red and dark red are the great barriers, meaning those are the world's hardest border situations. This is where Mr. Trump was wanting to build a border from Mexico, build a wall from Mexico, etc. These are the hardest borders in the world, because these are where the global north and south and this big inequity comes and slams together. And so these become very contested kinds of space. So instead of the global north and south, I prefer using a word coined by Shahidul Alam, who is a photographer from Bangladesh, who called it the majority world. He called it the majority world in the context of a biennale that he was organizing on photography. He's an activist and a photographer, was arrested recently, resisting the government. But the majority world is a much more accurate term, because it's in this part, what we call the global south, where the majority of the world's population resides. And I'm emphasizing this because for us as designers, and where we work in India, the very phenomena and the very idea of human beings in space is the critical dimension that we have to respond to. And therefore, flux becomes something we have to sensitize ourselves to, because it is humans in space. It's not about architecture only. It's about how we create the spatial possibilities for human beings to live and dwell in space. And so the majority world is a very good description, because it puts the human being at the center of the metric, of the imagination of what this place is about. And this sort of flux and movement has happened historically. It's sometimes for economic reasons, sometimes it's international, sometimes it's national. And then it begins to create these sorts of contestations, as I told you, or as I showed you with the borders on that global map. But then if you take this idea of flux, I think then what itself is urban is a question, because I mean, I think what we say is urban, I don't even think it's any longer valid. I mean, the urban-rural binary doesn't exist. There's something that's happening in between. There's something else that's happening. And I believe this phenomena is the phenomena of flux, which is creating these blurs between the urban and the rural. And therefore, when we talk about the urban and we try to come up with definitions, it's precisely this. And here, landscape architecture, for example, becomes such an important instrument in being able to help us define these territories, right? And it becomes, I think, in these kinds of questions that you begin to create the intersection between these disciplines of landscape, of urban planning, urban design, and even architecture. And I say even architecture casually, because I feel that architecture has for too long been preoccupied about itself being an autonomous object. And it has to dwell, it has to place its imaginations within these kinds of territorial fluxes and understanding how these territories work, because that is the context of the context we build in, and it affects what we build as architects every day. And this is where I think the agency that landscape architecture gets, urban planning and urban design gets, is much greater. So let's just look at India for a second before we come to the Kumbh Mela. In India, there are three criteria which allow you to become a census town, that you get recognized even as a town, therefore urban. And that is population over 5,000, density of 400 people per square kilometer. And that's 75% of the male population has to be in non-agricultural employment. This is very, very bizarre. These are sort of old criteria. It gives us about 7,523. This might be a little more. My data is a few years old. And so it gives you these cities. But if I take these criteria, if I take the criteria that I have and I begin to break the criteria down, and then I look at a map which just shows me where 5,000 people live, settlements of 5,000 people, I get this very finely pixelated diagram, which is wonderful because it tells you how actually decentralized perhaps settlement patterns are in India. It's finer grain than what I see here when I define the census towns, right? So I begin to see the territory in a different way. I begin to see what natural systems, if I overlay diagrams of this, of biodiversity, of the water systems, the rivers, I begin to start seeing a very nuanced understanding of the territory, correct? Now, if I take the criteria of density, the Indo-Gangetic Plain is the world's biggest megacity. It has got continuous urbanism all the way from Kashmir to the Delta, and it's like 200 miles wide. It's got a density clearly of 400 people per square kilometer must be the lowest density. It must be going much, 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 much higher, correct? So you get the world's biggest megacity right here, and then you get density along the coastlines, right? So you see an other kind of imagination in terms of how there is the interplay between the territory, the larger landscape, and where potentially settlement patterns exist. Now, if I take the third criteria, which is 75% of the male population in agricultural employment, actually the megacity doesn't even show up as a settlement because the Indo-Gangetic Plain, everyone is doing 50% agriculture, 50% something else, going to the city in the non-seasons before the harvest season, etc. So then if I take this last criteria, there's very few places in India where somebody is totally 100% in non-agricultural employment or even over 75%. So it's a very bizarre criteria. And I mean, there's a deep politics and history behind it, which, I don't know off the top of my head, but I've read about. But you get a completely different reading about urban India. So that Indo-Gangetic Plain, which is like Uttar Pradesh, part of Bihar and all of that, and Bengal, is really, it's an amazing, so therefore the imagination for urban design there will be quite different because there's nothing like an urban rural there. It's all one territory. And therefore how landscape and urbanism, landscape, urban design begin to talk to each other, begin to create new formulations of settlements is the challenge for the future, for the next generation. We have to imagine new ways that settlement patterns can be imagined. It is not urban design in the form of the city as we imagined it as a stable entity. It's about something else, right? And therefore, that's why when you look at the Indo-Gangetic Plain, Uttar Pradesh, that Indo-Gangetic Plain, and actually part of it, which is just Uttar Pradesh, it has more population in that one orange blob you see than all these countries that you see in purple. So it is bigger than most countries. I mean, America is a little bigger, but Canada is like much, much smaller. The entire population of Latin America is smaller than Uttar Pradesh. So look, what we are talking about here is mind-blowing, and it's completely different. And what is also mind-blowing is that you get two completely different readings of the urban when you use these two different criteria put next to each other. And that's sort of amazing. So where do we as architects and designers and landscape architects come into this? Which is the condition that we are responding to? This is what we have to talk about. And this is the challenge that we have to prepare ourselves for the future. Because in this condition, all these beautiful binaries, which are very important. Binaries are a great way of arranging the world around us and understanding it, correct? But they are completely non-productive when we have to act as designers. Because what do? We become part of one of the worlds. We become either part of the formal world and we design for developers and governments and private enterprise, or we become very socially conscious and we work with the informal sector to upgrade slums, etc. But actually, design is about synthesis. Design is about how we make these binaries completely blur. Why should the binaries exist? The state and private can work together. They can't need to be separated entities, right? The rich and poor, the global, local, all of these are binaries that become non-productive, and we perpetuate this in the way we construct the narratives about urban design planning and about architecture. Because when flux hits the ground, actually these binaries in space actually conflict and they blur on themselves, because I would argue that here even architecture and its meaning is not in parallel, because a lot of the people who live in what you would call the informal city are often employed in very formal jobs. And I'm saying this half jokingly and half seriously, all the people you see living in these beautiful buildings are often involved with the informal economy, right? That's how they get so rich sometimes. And so therefore, the meaning of architecture and the economy, for example, is also a complete blur. So I call this the kinetic city. It's a city which, it's a city that presents a sort of compelling vision that potentially allows us to understand this condition better, these blurred lines of contemporary urbanism and the changing role of people in space and in society. I think the increasing concentration, in a sense, of global flows that have affected all our cities in India have heightened this inequality and the spatial divisions of social classes. And in this context, in architecture or in urbanism or landscape design, of equality is an increasingly inequitable condition requiring a much deeper looking at and finding ways and ranges and places to mark, commemorate, celebrate the cultures of those actually excluded from the spaces of global flows. And so that's another binary that we need to have to dissolve. In fact, for me, in the kinetic city, it's not about, it's an elastic urban condition. It's not about a grand vision as we often imagine in our professions, but it's about a grand adjustment. How do we adjust these disparities in space? It's a very big difference, because in grand visions, you imagine end state. In grand adjustments, you can't imagine end states. You start setting up systemic processes. And I think that becomes a very big difference. It begins to create a blur also between natural systems, which landscape architects are otherwise obsessed about, but also man-made settlement patterns and systemic kinds of propositions, which urban designers and planners are engaged with, and architects by extension. And again, that is a very important blur that is necessary to deactivate in a sense. And so I describe the kinetic city as one that is elastic, that is built out of incrementalism. It's about appropriation, reappropriation, deappropriation of space. And it is about soft threshold, where the threshold, which is usually a divider, actually becomes porous. Sometimes it becomes expanded and becomes very wide. People dwell often in the threshold. And so this is a different imagination then of what we might think as urban space. And there are many little increments that make the space. It's called the 5 stages of squatting. This guy's in the 3rd stage of squatting. Our cities get made incrementally over a year like this. They have their own kind of logic. Space is elastic. During the Ganesh festival in Mumbai, an ordinary street becomes a community center for 10 days. And this is built in plaster of Paris, and it's dismantled after 10 days and the street goes back to normal. Or when we have these Maidans in Mumbai where we play this beautiful game, this beautiful Indian game that the British invented called cricket. What happens in the evening? A wedding comes and plonks itself there. And the cricket pitch no one touches because that's sacred. Everyone understands that. And here the club members have tea and samosas from the same kitchen while the wedding is on. And in the morning, the wedding disappears and the cricket is back. Or if you look at the Dabbawalas, which is a very celebrated thing, it actually is an informal economy using building a formal infrastructure of the city, in this case, the railway system, but it completely blurs. One can't exist without the other. The Dabbawala is possible because you have the informal city. You can't celebrate the Dabbawala as an informal economy without recognizing the formality of the infrastructure that they leverage, right? So we cannot separate these things out as binaries because they are intrinsically actually linked. And the Dabbawala is a great example of that, where this formal piece of infrastructure makes that possible. In this imagination of the city, architecture is not even the spectacle of the city. It becomes these sorts of festivals like the Ganesh Chaturthi, and the presence, their everyday presence on the landscape, whether it's Muharram, Tazia, Durga Puja, Ganesh, Dasera. It's amazing how these become the memorable moments. And here on the last day, when the Ganesh idol, which is made out of clay, and as you know, there are thousands of these that come out, even small shrines or idols which are for families, which come out on the 2nd and the 5th day. This comes out on the 10th day for the larger celebration. But when this clay idol dissolves in the water and it's put to rest in the bay, immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city. Because here, as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode this spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process. It's an enacted moment. It's a temporal moment as opposed to buildings which codify meaning in a kind of static way. So here, the meaning of the city and its architecture are not the same. Here, the kinetic city recycles the images of the static city, which is the background, and creates new spectacles, right? So again, here you have a complete dissolving of the binary between the static and the kinetic city. They both play off each other in terms of stability and instability, in terms of permanence and in terms of temporality, in terms of architecture as a codifier of memory, and the enacted process, which is also a very powerful codifier of memory, but it's ephemeral, it's reversible. And so the kinetic city is not perceived by architecture or cohesive urban design only. It is an indigenous urbanism that has its own local logic, right? It is not necessarily the city of the poor, as most images might suggest. Rather, it's a temporal articulation and occupation of space, which not only creates a richer sensibility of spatial occupation, but also suggests how spatial limits are expanded to include formerly unimagined uses in dense urban conditions. So it's a whole different logic. So here, the idea of the city is not about grand vision, but it's about grand adjustment. Now, this is very different from the minority world, because this is the majority world. And so here, I call this the landscape of impatient capital and the architecture of impatient capital. These are places like Dubai and Shanghai, and where the terrain is made frictionless for capital to arrive and to manifest itself and to realize its value. So these are very brittle forms, and this is where architecture is the central and perhaps the only spectacle of the city. My colleague Joan Busquets, who's a Spanish architect from Barcelona, has this wonderful diagram where he shows how in the traditional city you had urbanization, plot division, and building. In the garden city, development two collapsed. In housing estates, which all our developers do all over India now, actually urbanization, plot division, and building collapse into one entity. But historically, buildings come last after urbanization and plot division. In informal housing, or what we see in most of our landscapes, actually building comes first, then there's a legitimization through regularizing a slum, and then there's upgradation through urbanization processes. And so it's completely reversed, correct? And so how does one even imagine urban design or thinking about planning in this? So this challenges the idea of the city as a static and a stable entity, where architecture is the only instrument by which a city can be imagined. And it's in this context that I was interested in doing the Kumbh Mela, which you really asked me to share, and I'm going to now talk about very quickly. So the Kumbh Mela, we called it mapping the ephemeral megacity. And this is a very personal experience or a personal anecdote that I was involved in developing these ideas about the kinetic city. And one day, and I would always, in a teasing way, I would end my lectures to my students by showing the Kumbh Mela. And I would say that, look, the kinetic city idea, actually, there's a whole city that gets built every 12 years. And before it happened the last time, the big one, I kind of one day got up and I said, my God, I should go to the Kumbh Mela. And before I knew it, everyone in the university I spoke about was very excited, and it became a university-wide project. We did a seminar to prepare for it, and Diana Eck, who's written the book on Banaras and who is an authority, and she was my professor when I was a student. I mean, she said it's my life dream come true to go to the Kumbh Mela, so let's do it. And so we organized a massive project at the university, which involved 5 schools. And we asked a series of questions, and it really became an interdisciplinary project. And I can talk, if you're interested in the questions, about why it worked as an interdisciplinary project. And off we went to the Kumbh. So while I take a 1-minute rest, I'm going to just show you some images from a film. This is something we made after we came back, just to explain it. So this is it's a longer film, but you get an idea of the intensity and some of the images. And so, we did many things, and I'm going to run through this very quickly and just share with you 2-3 things that I think are worth discussing. One is, of course, we looked at archives. We found the plans from 1954. We started seeing how the pattern of the settlement changed. When Chandigarh was built, then the next Kumbh Mela called it sectors. Before that, it was the British town planning schemes that were used. So in a sense, the Kumbh Mela was also reflective of the current trends, in a sense, one could argue perhaps, that were prevalent in India. We looked at, archives in Allahabad University about the kinds of diseases in the early years. This is from 1894, 19 January 1894. The British were already beginning to map what diseases were taking place, what are the infections. So it was a public health. And then we began to see how, this was from January 1930, how the akhadas were being organized in terms of who had a bath first, because there used to be bloodbaths in people fighting to get into the water at the sacred time, at the right time. So there were all these sorts of logistical things. And then how the plans began to evolve by 89. And then I think by 2001, it was a different kind of plan, because also the river moves. So the terrain available is different. We also kind of did a geospatial mapping with photographs, which we sort of organized and correlated so that you could get a kind of archive, which we then captured in these kinds of books we did. It's very difficult to get permission for cars. So on one of the police vans, for about 10 days, we attached cameras so we can get Google Street views. So that's how we mapped it also. So we got some views. Drone photography wasn't allowed because of security reasons, but we found that there was a loophole, which means you could use a kite. So we got Dinesh Mehta from Ahmedabad, who put a camera. You can see the camera hanging from the kite. And we did all our photography that you'll see in the subsequent things through a kite. And they were really superb photographs. And what was very interesting, just as an aside, we reached our first day was the day the Mela opened, which is on Makar Sankranti. And so we went on Makar Sankranti and we started flying the kite to start documenting. And we forgot that it was also Makar Sankranti, means everyone is doing the kite flying. And before we knew it, about 10 kites came and cut our kite down, because everyone was doing kite fights. But luckily it was all sand, so the camera survived. But the kite became, I think, an icon for those 10 days or 12 days we were there, and Dinesh was there longer documenting it. And we structured it in many domains because it was an interdisciplinary thing. So we had a domain of religion, of urbanism, of business, of technology. It was the first Kumbh Mela where cell phones would have been available. So we looked at technology. And of course, public health was the biggest study. And the public health school had students there throughout the whole Kumbh Mela, and they had associates from the local hospitals. So they did massive data gathering, and we looked at governance, and then we looked at engineering. And by engineering, it was also sort of design. And so, that's the watery terrain we first saw when we went there in September to do our recce's. Those are the kinds of images we got from the kite, where we could map in quite a lot of detail and understand patterns. We also, from Google Images and kite photography, created an AutoCAD drawing. So we have an AutoCAD drawing of the whole Kumbh Mela of that year. And you can, for example, get the density, get the length of roads. So this is an AutoCAD drawing. So we digitized all of that. We also made drawings of things like the bridges and things which people just make. They're no drawings. They just have a pharma and they do it. But we actually made construction drawings of all the bridges. We studied the roads and the methods of making the roads with metal plates, measured them, dimensioned them. We looked at that whole process. We looked at circulation routes, pedestrian. We looked at circulation to the Sangam on the main days, how it's managed. We looked at police control. We looked at the systems by which they manage crowds, their control rooms, security, and many. So each of these could be a lecture in itself. And because we have written about it in the book, I haven't written everything. Different people have done different sections. I don't want to repeat all of that. But this whole security thing was a very interesting part of the study. The streets and the street gradients, but essentially it's a religious festival. So finally, the religious characters, the religious functions, the gurus, the akhadas, it is a religious retreat, and there's no question about it. And the process is very interesting because it's only in late October that the water frees completely from the terrain. And the process is they first come in, they even out the land. Here you can see the water is all not gone. And then the roads are laid out with the electrical systems on a grid, and that's the grid. And then that grid is used to allocate And actually no drawings are used. They're all marked on the ground. This is drawings we made. They had no drawings. They had a very broad drawing of the grid, because based on the grid, the different sectors or the plots are allocated to the different akhadas and people who apply for it. And then they're marked out in the sand. Then a puja is done and they are made sacred. Then the staking out is done by that akhada so that they can claim that land. And then the construction begins. And this is all now happening in November and December, actually late November and December. And it's amazing, in those 2 months, 2.5 months, by 15th of January, a whole city emerges. And it's a city that it houses 5 to 7 million people for 55 days. And many more people visit, something like 100 million on the 5 religious days, or the sacred days, or the days that are the best for the holy dip in the Sangam. And then these layers of material come on, fabric. This is the only thing that goes underground, is the water pipes and the septic tanks. The rest all stays and just touches the ground very lightly. So you could say it's also the lightest megacity in the world, because it just touches the ground and the sand without any foundations, which is mind-blowing. And then here you see the pipes, and then the city sort of appears. And really, from the time that the waters recede and the sand bars emerge, it's really 2.5 months. And this whole city is laid out in that time. And these are 2 images. One on the top I took when I went there in September, when the river was yet flowing. And then I went back to the same spot, into the river. This tree was my only reference. And that's what one saw, 2.5 months, 3 months later. A whole city had emerged exactly in that same spot, because the river had receded. And it really is a grid. It's very logical. There's a grid that's laid out there. But the difference is that every road on that grid goes across as a pontoon bridge. So it's a very resilient system. And it allows the flux in the river. And that's why you see a margin of the sand bank that is left, so that in case the river fluctuates, if there's an unseasonal rain, and they open the dam upstream just to flush the water so that it stays sanitary. So it also accounts for these fluctuations in a sense. And it replicates all the systems of a regular mega city built anywhere in India. And it's amazing in terms of the infrastructure, how it counts for both physical as well. I mean, 10,500 sweepers. I always said that it was the cleanest Indian city I had lived in. It was spotlessly clean. You have ambulances, you have hospitals. That's how it compares to Manhattan. So if you took a city like Manhattan and imagined every road going across as a bridge, you would get a really resilient system. You'd never have a traffic jam. And then it, of course, takes on this expression. But I want to, share with you 2 or 3 things that for me were particularly important. One was that you see a city like this built, but then you realize when you look at it closely that it's all built from using only 5 materials. And those 5 materials are 8-foot-tall bamboo, a skinning material like textile or canvas or plastic sheets, string and rope, screws, and sometimes very rich textiles. But that's what ramps up from a small tent to a big temple. But it's only 5 materials. So it's like a kit of parts that's deployed to create such incredible variation that you don't even realize it. So as a system, it's actually quite mind-boggling. And of course, it's evolved over time. It's evolved in ways that it can be deployed, assembled, and disassembled very quickly. And these are large, big temples. So this was one aspect of it that, at least for me, was very interesting. The second aspect is even more fascinating, which is the whole governance system is also on a temporal scale. It's not static. It fluctuates depending on the stage of the building of the temporary city. So it starts with the chief minister. In this case, it was Akhilesh Yadav, who announces it, and he sanctions the master plan and the budget, and he appoints the key bureaucrats that you see listed here, and they begin to start setting it up. Then after a few months, the bureaucrats take over, and then the chief secretary of the state becomes the boss. And then he starts appointing more people, having meetings, consulting with the religious leaders, figuring out their needs, anticipating what might happen. Then the next stage is that it goes to the commissioner of Allahabad. And here you see him in meetings with people. He's beginning to now go below the circle. So the bureaucrats on the top exist, but you're not reporting to them. The power has devolved to the commissioner of Allahabad. And he begins to start appointing different people. And the man you see sitting here is Madan Lal Mishra, who then becomes the Kumbh Mela Adhikari. So he becomes then the commissioner of the Mela, reporting to the commissioner of Allahabad, who then reports to one or two other senior bureaucrats. But by the time Madan Lal Mishra becomes the Mela Adhikari, he can go outside the circle and he can appoint subcontractors, he can bring people in, and he reports to just the commissioner of Allahabad and one other person, and that's it. And the commissioner can then go and relate to the chief minister, etc., to get orders. So it's a very nimble, very quick administrative structure, very complex. But actually, if you deconstruct it like the way I showed you, the movement of decision becomes incredibly quick. Now, if you think about it, with climate change, with the kinds of problems we're having in all our cities, with the pandemic, actually governance systems in the city sometimes are more static than even the architecture. And they don't have the ability to have the flexibility to deal with this flux. So when I talk about flux, it's not only a matter of design where you might want to have space for temporary uses, you might want to have elasticity in terms of how space is articulated. We have the advantage that our climate allows that, but we have to also imagine governance systems that allow this kind of flexibility so we can respond much more quickly to things. And this is complicated, but I mean, this is one of the things that for me at least was very inspiring. And then what is very interesting is on the last day of the Mela, the offerings are made to the Mother Ganges by all the high priests, in a sense, and priestesses. There were some of them. And then within a week, the whole Mela is dismantled. And these are images taken a week after, or 10 days after the Mela was over. I mean, people have left some cows. The farmers come in and they start doing some agriculture for 2-3 months because the grid is there. The land is flat. The mats remain. I mean, of course, there's some forms of pollution they haven't been able to yet deal with, but most of it is degradable. And a lot of the material gets sort of distributed to the smaller villages. And one of the things that we could not study, which I hope someone will study in the future, is the material geography, because the material comes from the hinterland and then it goes back to the hinterland. It gets recycled in smaller villages. Some of the pontoon bridges go to villages. Some things are stored for the future years. But the material geography in terms of food, in terms of building material, in terms of all the bamboo, the cloth, all of that is fascinating, how it comes from the hinterland of Uttar Pradesh, that large area, and kind of goes back. And then what's amazing is, of course, by June or July, the water floods again with the rain, and you have remnants of the old roads from the grid that are left, but it kind of completely disappears and gets flooded over again. And all that is left is some memory. It was also an enacted process in a sense, like the immersion of the Ganesh. The spectacle is an enacted process. But you know what is very important to understand is we don't create the binary again and we say we have formal cities and this was just an informal city. This was just a pop-up thing. No, actually, this was a very formal, a very intentional, a very deliberate city. In fact, it was more efficient than most of our what we call permanent cities. So we have a lot to learn from it. And that's why, at least I thought it was important. But for us, it wasn't just there because, you know, we thought, my God, if you just take the Kumbh Mela, I mean, can that open up another door? And so then we expanded our research and we opened up the rubric. So we took kinetic and city and converted kinetic to ephemeral and city to urbanism, so that the rubric becomes very broad. And then we started our research called ephemeral urbanism. which is saying that a lot of people, a lot of human beings dwell in these sorts of conditions. We call it formal, informal. We attribute through the aesthetic a categorization of it. And that I think is a real mistake. And so now I'm going to just share with you a little bit of this ephemeral urbanism research because it really expands on the Kumbh Mela. So these were all the cases we studied. And this is the taxonomy that we created. So I won't, I mean, it goes on and it takes each one and it shows you plans and things like that. These were for an installation. But essentially what we tried to do was create a taxonomy and see, because, what are the ephemeral landscapes of religion, which is about single purpose and about, a bigger conception, is quite different from an ephemeral landscape for disaster, where the whole psyche is kind of different. So therefore, one can't just put them all in the same bucket, which is what happens. And then we take an aesthetic of tents and shanty towns and temporary structures and say that's like informal settlements, right? So this is about how you can nuance that and kind of really calibrate ways that you can look at not only the time rhythms, but also the associative values that go with the making of those settlements. What are the aspirations that make them, or what are the conditions or the situations that make them? And of course, this is historic. There's Christmas markets in Europe, which go on even today. They get popped up on a plaza and they disappear. You have parking lots in Mexico, which 50,000 vendors use on weekends all over the city. It's a whole system. The farmers market in many parts of the world, markets in many parts of Asia. Burning Man for celebration, 60,000 people live here. It's not as big as the Kumbh Mela, but it is about how people within a time frame come together. Towns for extraction are very interesting. I visited many in Chile, and they're like ghost towns because when the copper runs out, the town gets abandoned. And so therefore, can you design it in a way that its expiration date is 50 years, right? So really the question we were asking is, we were taking settlements for our studies. We took hundreds of cases around the world, but the criteria was that we should know what the expiration date is. If we could predict the expiration date of a landscape or transaction was just the weekend or just one afternoon, that was an expiration date. Or mining towns were 50 years because the resource ran out, that had an expiration date. So by defining the expiration date, one could bring the notion of time in understanding how these settlements actually organize themselves, or for religion, or for refuge or refugee camps, as you might call them. I mean, these are now becoming large settlements, and our estimate was all these case studies that we made, there are about 300 million people on the planet that live like this, which is a massive amount. So therefore, again, what is the question is the agency of architecture, the agency of urban design, planning, landscape architecture, in looking at places like this, or military camps, which are around for decades sometimes. So that really became the taxonomy. These became all the cases that we studied. And then we were beginning to try to see how we can map time in terms of how they're imagined, how long they exist, etc. And then this became, actually these films were from this installation at the Venice Biennale, maybe 6 years ago, 8 years ago, I can't remember. And the exhibition was called Does Permanence Matter? And that was a provocation to architects in the Biennale. And these two films I showed you were actually on the two ends in the room. And so they were part of an installation, therefore their pace and their rhythm, which was more to engage someone in an exhibition. And then this is the book that became the second volume after the Kumbh Mela book, and it's called Ephemeral Urbanism, Does Permanence Matter? And so this documents all the work I've just shown you of the taxonomy of the different cases and an argument. It's got essays by Richard Sennett and Ricky Burdett. So it's also got urbanists and Richard Sennett, who's a sociologist, talking about how one can understand this in a much more global kind of framework. And so what one has learned from this is that are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems becomes the big question. And therefore, how do we as professionals, I mean, provoke ourselves both in the academy as teachers, but also as professionals when we go out into the world, is how do we design transitions and not only think in terms of absolute solutions, and how do we look at transitional landscapes, like, so all the peri-urban conditions which no one is willing to engage in, because we want to engage with the center of the city because that's where the images are cohesive. So we would rather excuse me, we would rather improve a sidewalk or a street or a historic district than actually deal with a peri-urban, because a peri-urban is in flux. We don't know where what is going to settle, so we don't know how to anticipate it. And we are so obsessed with permanence that whether it's a sidewalk or whether it's restoring a heritage building, we want permanence, right? And so therefore the question becomes, does permanence matter? Is permanence the only thing we should be obsessed with? If you put that aside for a minute, then you begin to see many other problems, you begin to see many other solutions, you begin to see transitionary solutions, and you begin to basically rethink how urban design might actually play out in a time of flux. And so if we look at urbanization even more broadly, there is a lot of flux. The kind of flux we are describing in India is of intense magnitudes, as I showed you with that plan of Uttar Pradesh. But if you look at the world, the largest most of the global cities are actually coastal cities, which means with climate change, we are like lemmings. We're all going to the water, which is going to rise, right? And so you're going to have transitional questions which are going to be immense. Look at Mumbai, floods terribly every day. I mean, the UN has, every monsoon, the UN has predicted that what they had projected as 20 and 30 years is now going to happen in 5 or 10 years. So what would happen? There would be retreat. There would be transitional landscapes that will occur. The hinterland will begin to organize itself, and we are not paying attention to that. We'd rather stay with the city center. We should be paying attention to how Alibag might really become a part of Mumbai, how the metropolitan region could be imagined. But because there's too much flux there, we don't know how to deal with it. And so, and population is only growing. Urban populations are getting bigger. These numbers are humongous. The earth, it's already 40% urban. People say it'll become 50% urban. I don't believe the definition of urban is even valuable any longer, because you're going to have many peri-urban conditions. And that's where actually the solutions will lie. They won't lie in the center of the city. The solutions to Dharavi in Mumbai lie in the metropolitan region of Mumbai and the regional plan, not in trying to improve and redevelop Dharavi. They absolutely don't. I don't believe they do. And that is what we as professionals are avoiding. And so therefore, for me, what has been inspirational with the Kumbh Mela study, with trying to expand the readings of the kinetic city, is to find other spaces that we might pay our attention, or the next generation. Maybe, we are past the point, at least I'm past the point. But I think for the next generation to think about these areas, the smaller towns, the peri-urban, the areas that are not rural, not urban, they're somewhere in between. That is where actually the solutions will lie. But that's also where the new theory that will inform landscape, urban planning, urban design, and architecture will arise. We have to look at sort of those zones in terms of the future, And so this idea of flux, which I go back in this majority world, and I'm just going to use this map, it plays out in many ways. And some of the other research I'm doing, which is going to be a book soon, is looking at the idea of sanitation. And so if I took the same majority minority world map, and I took the map and I did a mapping with my students of water distress, cholera, malaria, malnutrition in children. And what is amazing is all those domains, they map exactly in that north-south divide. So it's frightening how if we just replicate the solutions of the West, we replicate the idea of the city as a static entity, we replicate settlement patterns which come from a minority world with much lesser densities and higher income, just to the global south or the majority world, it's not going to land on the ground, and it hasn't. And we know that. It's already been proved. Why are we perpetuating that? And so, there are many domains like sanitation where this is going to become acute. So if I then take the map of Mumbai, which we did, and we, according to the census, we looked at district level sanitation problems. The largest sanitation problems coincide with the world's biggest megacity, which is the Indo-Gangetic Plain. All the domains of these diseases, malnutrition, all lie exactly where this megacity is, because we haven't found ways of imagining it. And so that will be the form of the city finally for us if we don't recognize this. I hate to to be so dystopic in my imagery. But really, that is the city we are heading for if we don't see the problem differently and we don't define our own parameters to challenge ourselves to actually design transitions before we can design end state transformations. And I think this really is the challenge for the future, for the next generation, and for all of us who teach and who are in the academy and produce the research and the theory by which work is guided. I think this will be a challenge in the future. So just in summary, I think the Kumbh Mela, I'm glad you asked me to present it, but for me that was merely one small milestone in a larger question about questioning how we see the Indian city. And for me, it was really the kinetic city observations that got expanded into the Kumbh Mela, that have expanded into ephemeral urbanism, that have expanded into trying to understand more finely the pattern of urbanization in India, its intersection with sanitation, to see how we might find the places where our intervention as professionals would be the most valuable, and how we can prepare the next generation to see the problems in a way that they can define their own agency for the future in a way that they would be useful to society, which is what society invests in all of us to make us architects and landscape architects and planners. So thanks very much for your attention. I'm sorry I spoke for an hour. If that was too long, apologies.
Thanks, sir, for the wonderful presentation. So now we would like to open the questionnaire session. The questions have been also sent to your chat box. You would like to me to read the questions, or so okay. So
I can read the questions.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask a question? Your talk about 5 ingredients creating diversity. Do you think you can give clues on urbanism and suggestive of using lesser number? I don't understand which 5 ingredients. Sorry, Rajat Kant.
Yeah. So yes, sir. So I'll read the question. So there is one question from Saurabh Tiwari, Department of Design, SPA Bhopal. So he's asking, there are spaces around the Delhi NCR with farmers protesting for the last few years, week now. How do you see these spaces for protest through the kinetic city lens and with all the essential available on the ground? What is usually the politics of a kinetic city?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you can inflate this question to include the farmers' protests. Yes, of course, the farmers are occupying the space in a temporary way. So don't confuse that with the kinetic city. I mean, that is just a temporary occupation of space for a particular reason. It's a form of ephemeral urbanism. And the way they are now organizing food, they're organizing dissemination of information, social platforms, etc., is exactly that. It is ephemeral urbanism in its way. But, I mean, I think the kinetic city, well, it's an expansion of the idea of informality. And informality is anything outside the formal state. But I actually define informality as what the state could irresponsibly not provide. And so then people do that for themselves. But I think the kinetic city is one where it's not about the poor or the rich. It dissolves even that binary. And that's why the weddings are the very rich using space in that temporary articulation, right? So the Dabbawala, similarly, it's about the infiltration of the informal into the formal to create a third space. But what is most important is it's also a realization for us that space can be more elastic, that space can actually accommodate unintended or even unimagined uses. It actually challenges our imagination. And therefore, can we think of cities like that? Can we think of cities not as static zoning where it's residential, commercial, but can we have these third spaces where these kind of formalities blur, where we don't invest stupidly in big shopping malls, but rather create fantastic huts where, I mean, hut meaning hut as in a market, where, transaction can occur. Why are we following the paradigms of the West and investing in what might eventually become redundant very quickly? Already the pandemic has shown us how many building types become totally redundant because you can't have so many people indoors together. But you can have markets like farmers markets at massive scales, and it would yet work, and it would be reversible. And that same space, when the market is not on, can be used for something else. That is the elasticity which which does two things. One is that it's a much more economic disposition of resources, but also it doesn't lock us into permanent solutions and in permanent infrastructure and material, what is it, embodied energy, and all of that in materiality. And so I think it's just it's not an argument that all our cities should be like the Kumbh Mela and should be temporary. The argument is urban design needs to be infected with the notion of temporality, with the notion of reversibility, with imagining elasticity. It's about infecting the business as usual Western paradigms of urban design with what we are learning from our landscape, right? Theory is about reflecting on what happens in our lands. Well, theory is about reflecting what happens on the ground. Our urban design, planning, and landscape architecture theory all comes from the industrializing West, which is not only in another part of the world, but it's when industrialization happened. We are using those same theories and teaching those same theories and extending those same theories. So we have to construct our new theories. And I think this is why I use the word infect. We have to infect the existing theories with new paradigmic thinking. So that's where this perspective comes from.
Thank you. The second question is from Rajat Kant Lucknow. He's saying you talk about the 5 ingredients creating a diversity. Do you think this can give clues for urbanism and can be suggestive to using lesser number of ingredients to create equality enriching cities?
Now, I'm not sure which 5 ingredients he's referring to. Can he elaborate?
Uh, yeah. I'll ask him to be on the panel then. Can I move to second question then? Yeah. So the next question is that it is from a student. How many years before they start the work? And B, how many architects, planners, designers are involved in the process? Or totally organized through informal process of ground? And C, what is the cost of this quick city, economic and environmental?
I'm sure I'm not understood the question. Sorry, if you can try to.
The question is that how many years before they start the work, and the B, how many
which work for the Kumbh Mela?
Yes, for the Kumbh Mela. Yeah. Yeah. And the second is how many architects, planners, designers are involved in the process, totally organized through informal process of at ground, and what is the cost of this quick city, economic and environmental?
Yeah, so the last one I don't know. I mean, we could never ascertain that cost. You would need to think about this for 5 years before the Kumbh Mela, and someone needs to study it in much more detail. So honestly, I don't have an answer to the last number, which is a very important question. And that's the reason why I flagged out that somebody should study the material geography. That material geography, if you study, then you begin to start coming to the questions of costs, environmental impact, where's the material coming from, what gets recycled, what doesn't get recycled. So that is someone should take that on as a PhD project at some point. It would be a fantastic project. I don't have the energy to do it. But the other 2 questions you asked, from what I understand, the planning starts about a year in advance, maybe a year and 3 months in advance, not much more before that. And this is the Mahakumbh, meaning the 12-year cycle, right? The 4-year cycles are smaller, but those get repeated more easily. But from what we understood, it was about a year and a half. There were no architects and urban planners involved. But what happens is that usually the person who becomes a Mela Adhikari has usually served in some urban development ministry. So they have some urban experience. And because they're part of the urban development ministry secretariat, they have a good network. So then they get, it's all oral exchange of experiences and ideas. And it was a very informal, what we understood was it was very oral, it was very informal, there was very few written documents. Maybe now, they're rationalizing it more as it becomes bigger and bigger. But I think that was a turning point, that even the administration became very aware of the extent of the Kumbh Mela. In fact, the chief minister then, Akhilesh Yadav, within 6 months, he translated the book. So actually the Kumbh Mela book exists in Hindi, the same book. He took the Harvard University book and he translated it within 6 months. So it's maybe the first urban planning book in Hindi. And so the administration became very aware of it. And maybe now in the future, they might take some clues looking at the book and the ideas and the drawings. I don't know. But otherwise, it was a very informal activity. And I think the scope for young architects and urban planners, designers to get involved would be fantastic, because one could even do a zero energy Kumbh in the future, where everything is recycled, it's solar energy. And I mean, it could be the smartest city in India. It would make the smart city mission look like terrible if one could take the Kumbh and make it the smartest city, which is possible. So your generation should definitely challenge yourselves with getting involved in things like this.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah. The next question is from Rachna Khare, SPA Bhopal. She is saying, very inspiring work, so much to learn from. My question is how much time it takes for the land to come back to its original form and study on pollution, etc. So she is on the panel also. So Rachna ma'am, can you hear me? Would you like to add something in the question?
Hello. Yes, I'm very much here. Very inspiring work. We had a chance to work on Ujjain after going through your book and some of the works which are available online. We could learn a lot from that. And during that, we realized that it takes a lot of time, for the land to come back to its original form. There are so many issues related with the pollution, land pollution, and after, temporary toilets are being removed, land becomes very difficult. So is there any study which has been conducted and it talks about, how much time it takes for the land to come back to its original form and farmers can cultivate after that?
Yeah, not that I know of. The farmers cultivate actually from March to June, and then it gets flooded. So then it's not land, it's just water, right? So, but I mean, I think the pollution effect, there were some studies done because, I know, oh my God, the names are escaping me, but there was a whole akhada that all they did was they addressed environmental issues in that particular Kumbh, and Diana Eck, I think, worked with them and has even written a piece. I'm sure you'll find it online, or I can try to look for it, where she looked at some of these environmental questions. Because, the thing is that in principle, it can be a very ecologically friendly city. But what happens is, in the last minute, one is the toilets that they're deconstructed, but then there are finally some rogue elements who dump a lot of the garbage just in the river, which there's no need to do. And that's why I was sort of pointing out, I think, a study of the material geography and how the material can actually be reincorporated is really worthwhile someone taking on, because that could inform policy, it could inform ideas for the government also in terms of what material should be allowed and how they can be taken away and recycled. And then the toilets will be another problem to be solved, because they do a combination of septic tanks, but they also had many portable toilets, which they tried for the first time in the Kumbh Mela that we studied. But those then used chemicals for decomposition. I'm not sure that was yet appropriate as technology. So I think it's the energy, which means if they actually use renewables and if they had good forms of sanitation, good technology for sanitation, which would deter from the pollution, and they had good policy for material use and its recycling, then that, that 1 or 2 months of terrible waste that occurs there unchecked in some parts can also go away. So it's not a perfect operation from that perspective. And there was a lot of in the press, as you know, when it was being disassembled, that there were some people who were being very irresponsible with the way the waste was being, disposed.
Yeah, thank you so much. We actually met some of the people in Singhas during Kumbh. They lost the whole family. The person was a environmentalist himself, and he lost, when he was young, he lost his whole family in Kumbh after the Snan because of the infection. So he was doing some studies, and I was interested. So thank you so much. Thanks for answering.
So that's why what they were doing. I did I had my bath and absolved myself of all my ill doings, but the water moved and it was very fresh. and I don't think any of us got sick. But I think in the recent past, what they've been doing is, in a very calibrated way, they've been flushing it, which means they upstream, they've been releasing the barrage and calculating movement of water to be able to flush it enough, for exactly the same reasons that you're talking about, that in the past that those kinds of things would happen. And that's why when I talked about the pontoon bridges and the margin that they leave between the water and the first tents, is just so that if they have to flush it even more, because it is tested very regularly, and our public health team was also testing it very regularly. And in fact, one of the findings our public health group found, the public health faculty, was that the bigger problem was not intestinal or waterborne, but it was respiratory because of dust and things.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Thank you. So coming back to
the 5. Oh, you meant the 5 ingredients. Sorry, the question he has just clarified. So you had said the 5 ingredients are the bamboo and all of that. So what is your question? Sorry, I should have connected that. I don't know. By creating a device, you can give clues for urbanism and suggestive use of lesser number of. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, correct. So no, I mean, it's the approach. It's systemic thinking. It's the approach of the kit of parts that if you have a kit of parts, you can deploy it, but a kit of parts can also give you incredible variation. I mean, I think that is the thing to learn. And, whether it's the new urbanists, and I mean, this is Christopher Alexander did this with his pattern language. I mean, there are many ways. It's a way of creating a system where, you could do it at the level of urban design in terms of, pocket parks, streets, plazas. I mean, that becomes a kit of parts, right? You can arcades. So you can create a kit of parts for an urban system and show how they can be combined in different ways that they come together to get a great richness. In this case, it was just the settlement unit, which was from the tent to the temple, that they used that kit of parts, and it could expand and assemble and disassemble so quickly. So I think the kit of parts kind of thinking of components that aggregate to create variation it's been used a lot. And that's what Christopher Alexander was trying to understand in traditional architecture in some ways, in the book called Pattern Language. So there's a lot of work done on this aspect.
So thank you, Professor Rahul. That was a wonderful session. And now I would like to summarize the session. And I would like to thank you on the behalf of the director, Professor N. Sridharan, faculties, and the students. And thank you so much for an informative and wonderful session. It gave us a new perspective to observe and analyze Indian urban open spaces from a different lens, and how they are reshaping the contemporary cityscape for a short period of time, and managing skills of Indian people to celebrate their culture and festivals in these kinds of transitional urban open spaces. And thank you for making us understand the difference between the great grand adjustment and grand imagination, grand vision with respect to the Indian cities. And thank you so much for this one informative session. I would also like to thank the director and head of the department, Professor N. Sridharan, and all the faculties. And I would also like to thank my co-host, Professor Saurabh Tiwari, for managing organizing this session. So yes, thanks a lot, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thanks. Happy New Year to you all. Hope it's a better year than last year.
Have a safe.
Thank you. Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, sir. Bye, sir.